There can't be very many offices in the world where, in theory at least, if you want to go to the lavatory, you may have to take your passport with you. This is life on the edge in Herzogenrath. Now this may look like an ordinary residential street, but it is in fact an international border. The houses on this side are in Germany, while those on that side are in the Netherlands. The bus stops are German, but most of the road signs are Dutch because they're cheaper.
Let's first get our bearings. Herzogenrath lies just on the German side of the Dutch border. It's not a particularly remarkable town, but it does have a little castle. Meanwhile, on the Dutch side is the town of Kerkrade, which features a former abbey, now a hotel and conference centre. The story begins in 1104 near the little river Worm, an area that would later be known in the local dialect as Land van Rode. On top of one hill was a monastery, and to protect it, a castle was built nearby, while to the other side a little town grew up, Kerkrade.
This is the direct route from the castle to the abbey, and it's very difficult to see these days because of all these trees here, but this forest is relatively new. Back in the day, this area would have been cleared completely of trees so that the soldiers would have a clear view of the land they were trying to defend.
And this explains all the names, although they came a little later. Land van Rode means something like land of the clearing. The monastery became known as Kloosterrade, the monastery of the clearing, or Rolduc, from the French Rode-le-Duc, meaning the Duke's clearing. That name was also given to the settlement that grew up around the castle, which in German became Herzogenrath. Meanwhile, the little church to the west gave its name to that town, Kerkrade, meaning something like Church of the Clearing. This isn't the original church, unfortunately, but a replacement. It's important to remember that at the time there weren't clear and definite national borders the way we understand them today. There wasn't even a clear boundary between the German and Dutch languages. Rather, from southern Switzerland all the way to the North Sea, people spoke various West Germanic language varieties in what we call a dialect continuum. By the 13th century, coal was being mined here, which obviously became an important source of wealth for the region, and it remained so for centuries. It was fairly small scale until the end of the 19th century, when this region became the Netherlands' most important coal mining region. The industry has now disappeared from here, leaving occasional monuments like this one. You wouldn't think that this residential area was once a mine were it not for a sign and a statue of St. Barbara, the patron saint of miners. Another relic of the mines is this railway line, built in the 1920s to transport coal, known as the Million Line because it cost 1,000,000 guilders per kilometre. Today it's a heritage line with regular steam services for tourists and railway enthusiasts. But jumping back in time to the second half of the 18th century, methods for the transportation of coal were a lot more primitive. In 1783, it was agreed that the monks at Rolduc would pay for the construction of 2 roads, one of which would be known as New Street. In return, they would be allowed to collect tolls. Meanwhile, political things were afoot. Up until this time, both Herzogenrath and Kerkrade belonged to the Duchy of Limburg, but wars happened. Limburg itself was, for a while, part of a strange territory called the Austrian Netherlands. Then Napoleon made it a part of France until, in 1814, it was given to King William I of the Netherlands.
Now, in case you've ever wondered why international borders in this part of the world are not always very straight or logical, it's because they tend to follow geographical features. At this point, for example, the border follows the course of this little brook, with that bank belonging to the Netherlands and the other bank belonging to Germany.
And by that same logic, the Netherlands originally got everything up to the River Worm.
At this point, the River Worm still forms the border with the Netherlands on that side and Germany on the other. But it only does so as far as this road bridge behind me. It crosses over the road and then turns sharp right.
And that's because in 1816, as a result of the Vienna Congress, the Dutch King William I and the Prussian King Frederick William III agreed to move the border west to New Street. This left Herzogenrath cut off from the town it had become linked to and turned a road into a national border, and so it remains to this day. It is called New Street in German and in Dutch, at least for most of its length. The northernmost 200 metres of it are part of a different road in German but has the same name in Dutch. Confusing? Yeah, that's an understatement. At first, there was no physical border, and customs officials had no chance of actually extracting duties from the locals. Things changed, though, with the First World War. In 1915, so many German soldiers were deserting and fleeing to the Netherlands that the German authorities put up a 300-kilometre fence along the border, including here. Once that war was over, the fence was taken down and remained down until the Nazis came to power.
The border was notoriously difficult to police. Because the border guards simply refused to open fire on children, the locals simply got their children to do all of the smuggling. At least that is until the Gestapo took over, and they proved to be rather more ruthless.
And that ruthlessness finally put paid to the smuggling problem. A new war resulted in 1938 in the construction of a new fence, once more cutting the two towns off from each other. And once again, when the war was over, the fence was torn down by the locals and immediately replaced by the Allied soldiers now occupying Germany.
The smuggling restarted almost as soon as the war was over. In one very notorious case, a religious procession turned out to be the perfect cover for Dutch residents to give illicit gifts to their German friends and relatives. For years, border guards watched children innocently playing ball over the fence until they realised that their balls were full of coffee beans.
It's important to understand that the locals were still used to the idea of Herzogenrath and Kerkrade being two halves of the same city, and now they were supposed to go through official checkpoints like this one in what should be a quiet residential area, where their passports would be inspected and their bags searched, and this at a time of great economic hardship for Germany. Even the Catholic Church was sympathetic to the smuggling activities. Things didn't start to improve until, in 1953, Germany lowered its coffee tax, and yes, that was a thing. But still, bizarre things happened quite regularly.
On one Sunday morning in 1954, a Dutch couple was treated to a street procession in honour of their golden wedding anniversary. But at the time, playing public music on Sunday mornings was illegal in the Netherlands, and so the brass band that accompanied the procession had to remain silent. But when the procession reached this street, a German band was waiting on the other side of the border and started playing perfectly legally.
All this time, Germany and the Netherlands were squabbling over the border. The Netherlands wanted Germany to help pay for the costs of maintaining the fence. Germany didn't want a fence at all, and neither did the residents. But that problem solved itself when the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the EU, was founded, and in 1970 the fence could be replaced by a concrete wall.
And here's what that looked like. This short section has been kept as a memorial, but although at the time smuggling was much less of a problem than it had been previously, it was still illegal to cross the border without going through all the proper legal channels. Failure to do so could attract a fine of 20 German marks.
Yes, it was basically little more than a trip hazard, but it was still patrolled.
And right here is where two Dutch border guards were shot dead by German terrorists fleeing the country.
The terrorists were members of the Red Army faction, also known as the Baader Meinhof Gang. Left-wing domestic terrorism was a serious problem in Germany at the time. But the incident did highlight the essential pointlessness of the tiny wall, and things got particularly absurd when in 1989 residents on both sides petitioned their respective foreign ministries to have it removed. Since the Schengen Agreement hadn't been signed, that request was denied. Eventually, the Schengen Agreement did come into effect, sanity prevailed, and in 1993 the border was finally removed. But some things are still weird even now.
Possession of small amounts of cannabis is partially legalized in Germany and tolerated in the Netherlands. So if I had a little weed in my pocket, that would be fine. If you had some weed on you and you were standing on the other side of the road, that would be okay. But if either one of us crossed the road, that would be smuggling. And this is basically the end of the road. The border comes down here and then makes a sharp turn, roughly where I'm standing, and actually separates these buildings, the red brick building belonging to the Netherlands, the others belonging to Germany. There's even a little border stone to show you where the border is, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to tell.
This really does feel and function like a single town. Germans going out for a meal in a nice restaurant will probably hop over to the Dutch side. For Dutch residents, it seems that the German side has them covered for electronic goods. And although Kerkrade does have a tiny little station of its own, most residents treat Herzogenrath as their main station. This border-crossing double town has been given the name Eurode, a partnership of two municipalities cooperating closely with each other. The most striking symbol of this cooperation has to be the Eurode Business Centre, a small office block that sits exactly on the border, with half the offices and the men's lavatories on the German side and the other half with the women's lavatories on the Dutch side. And yes, according to the Schengen Agreement, even though routine passport controls are supposed to have been abolished, you are still legally required to carry a passport or a national identity card with you when you cross. I don't know how many people who work here actually obey this rule. This place was opened in 2001, and you may be wondering who would even need such a thing. Well, it turns out that there are a number of multinational businesses who find it very useful to have a little office with a Dutch address and telephone number and a German address and telephone number. As was explained to me, if you're a German and are looking for an architect, you might not call one that has a Dutch phone number. The EBC also has an information centre, not just for businesses. Members of the public who, say, live in one country but work in the other can get advice on, for example, how to deal with their taxes and manage their pensions. There's also a little joint police station, but it hasn't been staffed since the pandemic and probably isn't needed since the police on both sides already work very closely together. There were a few teething problems. For example, the letterboxes for all the companies and people registered here are at the back, but because the border goes off at an angle, they're all on the German side. At first, the Dutch mailman refused to put 1 foot over the border, claiming that this was against the rules, and instead just dumped the mail on the reception desk, which happens to be on the Dutch side. It took a while, but they eventually persuaded him. The pandemic, of course, created extra problems, and initially the fear was that the authorities would demand a physical barrier inside the building. Fortunately, they didn't, but there were still serious issues. For example, while Germans had no problem getting to a testing station, those on the Dutch side had to go to Maastricht, but trains to Maastricht go from Herzogenrath, which they couldn't legally get to. Now, I filmed the footage for this video back in the summer. Since then, fears of a return to the bad old days have resurfaced, this time as a response to large-scale migrations. Both the German and the Dutch governments have recently tightened border controls. So far, this doesn't seem to have had much of an impact on daily life here, and given the expense and difficulty involved, there doesn't seem to be much chance of a new fence down the middle of the road anytime soon. Nevertheless, according to my contact at the EBC, the political climate, particularly in the Netherlands, has changed, and there are concerns about how much more difficult an increasingly populist government can make life for the border regions.
Now, on this channel, I do like to showcase places that the average tourist wouldn't normally think of going, and Herzogenrath definitely falls into that category. One of the problems with this place, unfortunately, is that when the border was drawn up, quite obviously Germany got the wrong end of the deal. It got the railway station and a little castle, but the Netherlands got pretty much everything else, and so most of the interesting places are in Kerkrade. And I would point out for anybody who wants to stay around here, that includes most of the best places to eat. I found it very difficult to find anywhere here in Herzogenrath. But there are a lot of things to do all the same. You saw the steam train, there are some nice museums on the Dutch side, and there's a couple of places on the German side as well. And apart from that, well, if you've ever wondered about the arbitrariness of state borders, this is definitely one of those places you'd want to visit.
Perhaps opening the border again didn't do Herzogenrath any favours, as it has clearly seen better days. It even suffers from being by the river, which has had its banks replaced with concrete, so it now floods quite regularly. The hotel I stayed at still had the builders in after the last flood, and the manager told me his business wasn't going to survive the next one. Incidentally, if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can help me out by becoming a channel member, and in return for that, you get access to bonus members-only content. You can find out more by clicking on the join button or using the link in the description. I found the trains in the area particularly unreliable, but there are frequent local services from Aachen, and if you're coming from the Netherlands, Maastricht. Kerkrade is served every half hour by local trains from Sittard. The Deutschland ticket is of course valid on all German-operated buses, and this includes the number 34 bus all the way into Kerkrade.
I haven't found anybody who's prepared to talk about this. There can't be many... On one Sunday morning in 1954, a Dutch... In case you ever...